Rodney Alcala might not fit what we have in mind for a typical serial killer, and that's what makes him so terrifying. He had 135 IQ, was considered good-looking and reasonably successful. If you're imagining someone antisocial or an outcast, well, with Rodney, it's complicated. In high school, he was popular, athletic, and dated many girls. His family was normal. He wasn't abusing drugs or alcohol. There was absolutely no sign, even in hindsight, of the horror that was to come. In a moment, we'll talk to convicted killer William Noguera, who spent decades on San Quentin's death row with Alcala. He worked out with him, ate meals, asked him the kind of questions no FBI profiler could ask and expect an answer. Alcala, known as the dating game killer because of his appearance on the TV show, killed well over 100 women. Yet the scariest part is how normal he seemed. If he was your neighbor, you'd never know what he was. If he dated your daughter or your sister, you'd be thrilled. There was absolutely no way to know what sadistic thoughts were lurking within his mind. He was a monster that toyed with his victims, strangling them until they lost consciousness, then waiting till they revived, giving them false hope, repeating this several times before finally killing them. If there's a Rodney Alcala in your life right now, there might be no signs for you to look for, no warning of the danger. Rodney Alcala was born in San Antonio in 1943, the third of 4 children. When he was 8, his father moved the family to Mexico. Then 3 years later, he abandoned them. His mother took them to live in LA. He was a gifted, popular student with a loving and supportive mother. He ran track and joined the yearbook committee. The first hint of trouble, if it can even be called that, was when he joined the Army at 17. His commanding officer later said he was manipulative, vindictive, and insubordinate. On several occasions, he was disciplined for assaulting young women. There was the signs of trouble. In 1964, his 3rd year in the Army, he went AWOL and hitchhiked from his base in North Carolina back to his mother's home in LA. Tracked down by the Army, he was sent for psychological evaluation and was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. He was discharged on medical grounds, and he entered UCLA's School of Fine Arts. He would eventually study film at NYU under Roman Polanski. If it seems hard to square the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder with his seemingly normal high school years, well, yeah, and that discrepancy is where we need to look for insight. We'll get a lot more in the conversation with Bill Noguera shortly. Bill spent many years essentially socializing with this monster in prison as he tried to get inside his head. But how do you square his popularity in high school with his antisocial personality disorder? The answer can be summed up in one word: psychopathy. Psychopaths come in many varieties, but one of the identifying traits of the psychopath is that they wear masks. The hallmark work on psychopathy is by Dr. Harvey Cleckley. This was back in 1947, and it still stands today. His book was called The Mask of Sanity. He found that psychopaths wear facades in order to falsely present themselves to the world as like normal human beings. They use masks to hide the monster within. The more intelligent the psychopath is, the better they'll be able to do that. And Rodney Alcala was very intelligent. But just what was going on inside his mind during that critical adolescent period when sexual identity and fantasies are forming? Bill Noguera, as you'll hear in a moment, talked to Rodney about his high school dating years. There are no accounts of him doing anything violent or unusual during this period. Was there something that held him back from acting on monstrous urges, or had the monster within not fully formed yet? Much later in prison, did he look back at this time and wish he'd been somehow able to destroy the monster within, if nothing else, so that he didn't end up spending much of his life on death row? His first known attack occurred in 1968 when he was 25. Mid to late 20s seems to be a common coming out time for many serial killers, though it's possible Alcala killed at an earlier age and it just hasn't been discovered. I have to warn you, this next couple of sentences will be hard to hear, but I promise you it will be very brief and no graphic description. Alcala was driving when he spotted an 8-year-old girl walking to school. Telling her he knew her family, he convinced her to get in the car, then lured her into his apartment where he raped and beat her with a steel bar. Her life was saved because an alert motorist had witnessed Alcala coaxing the girl into his car and had called the police. They arrived in time to save the victim, and they put out a warrant for Alcala, who managed to flee. Now, the girl spent 32 days in a coma, but she lived. Alcala fled across the country and enrolled in NYU under the name John Berger. This is where he met the like-minded Polanski. Not that Polanski necessarily fantasized about killing people, but he had a thing for underage girls. It's not known if they shared any discussions about their tastes. In 1971, Alcala started a counseling job in New Hampshire at a camp for children. Also at this time, he worked for Blue Cross Insurance in New York City, and in the same building worked another serial killer, Richard Cottingham. Now, neither killer has claimed to have known the other, so it's probably just a coincidence, but as Bill Noguera will point out, it's not as unlikely as one would hope. These guys are more common than we think. It's not known if Alcala abused any of the children at the camp in New Hampshire, but we've learned in many other cases on this channel, and as Bill will explain, once these guys get started, it's nearly impossible for them to stop. He'd recently abducted the girl in California, then took the job at the camp in New Hampshire a couple years later. So it would be almost shocking if he made no attempt to act on his impulses in that period at the camp. His first known murder took place that year in 1971 when he strangled a flight attendant with her own nylons. It's believed he met her when she was moving into an apartment in New York and he'd offered help. That same year, because of the warrant for the rape of the little girl in LA, Alcala made the FBI's 10 most wanted. A couple of kids at the camp noticed his photo on the FBI list that was posted at camp, and he was arrested and extradited. Unfortunately, because the parents of the 8-year-old victim didn't want her to go through the trauma of testifying, understandable, the state was only able to charge him with molestation, so he was sentenced to 3 years and only served 17 months. For monsters, America is the land of opportunity. 2 months after his release, he was again arrested, this time for assaulting a 13-year-old girl when she accepted a ride to school. He served 2 years in prison before being sent out to continue his work. His parole officer actually allowed him to travel to New York. There he killed the 23-year-old daughter of a nightclub owner, the goddaughter of Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. By this time, Alcala had become a photographer and was luring aspiring models into his traps. The FBI was onto him, suspecting him in killing the daughter of the nightclub owner, but they couldn't nail down the evidence. He moved back to California and took a job at the LA Times and was even interviewed as a suspect during the Hillside Strangler investigation. He was ruled out, but continued to lure aspiring models, both male and female, showing his work to many colleagues. His subjects were generally posed naked and in suggestive poses. Some of these subjects are actually now suspected by police of being additional cold cases. Against all probability, in 1978, he managed to get on The Dating Game, a national TV show. And he managed to win, selected by the young woman to go on a date.
And here they are. Let's see, Baxter number one is a successful photographer who got his start when his father found him in the dark room at the age of 13, fully developed. Between takes, he might find him skydiving or motorcycling. Please welcome Rodney Alcala. Rod, welcome. OT and see how they sound. Number one, would you say hello to Cheryl, please?
We're going to have a great time together, Cheryl.
Okay, and here we go.
Bachelor number one.
Yes.
What's your best time?
The best time is at nighttime,
Why do you say that?
because that's the only time there is.
The only time? What's wrong with morning, afternoon?
Well, they're okay, but nighttime's when it really gets good. Then you're really ready.
I'm a drama teacher, and I'm going to audition each of you for my private class. Bachelor number one. You're a dirty old man. Take it.
Oh, come on, over here.
Oh, honey, we ought to go out and boogie. number one, I am serving you for dinner.
Oh,
What are you called, and what do you look like?
I'm called the banana, and I look really good.
Can you be a little more descriptive?
Peel me.
Later, Bachelor One, later.
Welcome back to the dating game. And Cheryl, we have reached the moment of truth, as we call it. You've heard from the bachelors. You got some great dramatic presentations, some good answers. But now I'm going to ask you a question. Will that date be bachelor number one, bachelor number two, or bachelor number three? Who gets the date?
Well, I like bananas, so I'll take one.
Number one, bachelor number one. All right. Well, there they go. However, you did leave one remaining, and this is your date, and I want to tell you something about him, Cheryl. He's a skydiver, so he's got a lot of nerve. He's into motorcycling. He's also a fine photographer. Say hello to Rodney Alcala. Rodney, come on and say hello. Congratulations, Rod. You did it with a one answer. Well, as far as I can see, Cheryl and Rodney, it looks like the two of you may be involved in some sort of racket. So we're going to have you taped to the court. Oh, first, you'll receive tennis lessons from expert Naomi.
Fortunately for her, she got a bad vibe and backed out. She didn't go on the date. Another contestant on the show said he was a strange guy with bizarre opinions. Bill Noguera asked Alcala if he would have killed the woman. The answer was fascinating. He also asked why Alcala risked going on the show in the first place, given that he was deep into his killing spree by then and could be recognized. The answer was insightful. I think you'll find it interesting. Alcala killed several young women after this, most horrifically a year after his dating game appearance. His victim was a 12-year-old girl who he'd stalked earlier on the beach and then abducted off her bicycle. The girl's friends had helped police develop a sketch, and Alcala's parole officer recognized him on that sketch. Police searched his mother's house, and in there they found a receipt for a storage locker. Inside that locker, the girl's earrings. It's worth remembering that keeping souvenirs is a very important thing to many of these guys, and if the killer lives in the city with a parent or a wife, then a storage locker seems like something they might use to keep these items. But this led to Alcala's eventual arrest in 1979, and finally, this beast was taken off the streets for good. He was sentenced to death and spent his remaining years on death row, where Bill Noguera spent many years getting to know. Now, just a reminder, Bill Noguera is a murderer, sentenced to death for killing his girlfriend's mother, but he didn't kill for pleasure. He's not a serial killer. He's not someone who has sexual urges about killing. I am not in any way defending him. I'm merely explaining the difference between him and the serial killers he spent decades profiling on death row. Okay, let's get to the interview.
I'm here with Bill Noguera to talk about the dating game killer, Rodney Alcala. Bill has spent 40 years in San Quentin and has been profiling serial killers for much of that time. He's going to give us personal stories of his time spent with Rodney and share the insights he's developed not only about Rodney, but about serial killers generally. Good morning, Bill.
Hey, good morning, Kevin. How are you?
Very good, very good. Good to hear you. I always enjoy our many conversations, and the audience is going to, I wish they could hear all of our conversations, but they're going to listen to a lot of it as we go forward. So what was the first time you met Rodney Alcala?
Well, I met Rodney Alcala, or Alcala, who is known as the dating game killer, back in the 80s, in 1986, 1985, 86. He actually was back in the county jail for a complete reversal. You see, he's a very intelligent individual. One of the things that, we see movies, we see documentaries, and we get this sense of a serial killer being this dark, genius type of individual who's able to outlast, outmaneuver, and outthink law enforcement. Well, Rodney Alcala is that guy. He has 170 IQ, which in my opinion is the highest IQ ever by a serial killer. He is calculated, he's extremely aggressive, and he is a mixed bag of tricks. And what I mean by that is that he is a person whose MO changes. He's also a man who adapts very quickly, and he's kind of a person with different tastes. And we'll know this more about this because of his crimes, and that he started with children, and he graduated to women, and he changed his MO numerous times throughout his life, as well as the parents. But I met him back in 1985 or 86 in the county jail, and that's where my relationship with him started.
What were your first impressions when you met him?
That he was very well-spoken, extremely calculated. He looked at you straight in the eyes. There was no deviation from who he is. When he spoke to me, he was always very eloquent. He was very direct. That is something you normally don't get, or I haven't gotten from many serial killers. A couple, but with him, that's what immediately distinguished him from other ones. Other ones like to try and hustle you. They try to, they come off as normal people. He came off like a person who had, everything he said was calculated. Everything he said was thought of very carefully.
Yeah, and he was his commanding officer in the Army. And we'll go into his past a little bit in a moment, but his commanding officer noted that he was very manipulative and vindictive and insubordinate. So did you sense any manipulation while you were there?
Yeah, that's very interesting you say that, because no, when he talked to you, it was, you could almost think that you're speaking to a parent or an officer of the courts or a lawyer. He was, as I said, his demeanor was extremely neutral. He wasn't trying to give you too much information. He wasn't trying to manipulate. When he came to speak to you, he just spoke to you. There was nothing, any sense of manipulation. Now, of course, when you ask people later on in years, well, what did you think of Rodney Alcala? Well, of course, they're going to take the model that they had in front of them, which is serial killer, rapist, child molester, etc., and then they're going to put their own spin on it that, yes, he was extremely manipulative, I saw this, I saw that. Well, they're playing armchair quarterback. The truth is, you couldn't tell. Because if you could tell that he was a child molester and all these different things, people would have excommunicated him from society. They never did. It was quite the opposite. He was brought into as a counselor for a camp in New York while he was on the run for raping and really harming a child. So no one can tell what this guy was about. So that anyone says that he was manipulated like his commanding officer, in my opinion, that's a crock of shit. They're just trying to fit a profile so they know what they're talking.
This call and/or telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
Take it for someone who has probably more experience with serial killers than anybody on earth. You could not tell. This guy was refined.
Is it possible that he just got it more under control by the time you got to know him because he was older? So, for instance, it's not clear here. It says his commanding officer noted him as being manipulative and vindictive and insubordinate. I don't know if those notes were from the time, or they were something that that the commanding officer noted later after he was arrested. So, is it possible that he was manipulative, but just got much better at hiding it because of his intelligence?
Well, absolutely. I think that he adapts really well. But the truth of the matter is, look, he won the dating game. It's the reason I call him the dating game killer, not because he killed anybody at a dating game, because he won on a dating game, and he won. He was that good where a person didn't see him, and she picked him out of 3 guys that were, for the most part, normal guys. I think, sure, he got better, but from the very beginning, he was very smooth. He knew how to speak. But think of it as a praying mantis, and I want the audience to really think about a praying mantis. Look, a praying mantis is an insect, but it's very quiet. It just stands there, it camouflages with its environment, and then it strikes. Rodney Alcala is very similar to that. He is a predator. He understands that he's a predator, and he's looking for victims. He's hunting always. He's stalking. So he camouflages it very well. He does it exceptionally well. And this is another thing the audience should take into consideration, because they should take out some of the clips on him on the dating game and what he looked like back then. For most appearance, I've asked women about this, he was not a bad-looking guy. He wasn't the kind of guy that would immediately draw attention like, oh, he's a creep. He was not. He was, in many cases, women considered him good-looking. He could date different more women. He was very manipulative. He was very intelligent. He could have had normal relationships with women. He chose not to.
Now, we can talk about in a bit whether you think he had the classic signs of psychopathy, but let's assume for the moment that he did, because at least just reading up on him, he seems to have all of the classic signs of a type 1 psychopath. But one of the main characteristics of a psychopath is impulsiveness, but it doesn't sound like you were seeing any of that. Did you see any signs of impulsiveness or trouble controlling? Go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, look, in the circumstances that we were in the same environment, meaning in the jail together and then on death row together, where we spent decades together, no, he didn't have any impulse issues because, of course, it's a very controlled environment. Obviously, he did have control issues, and that's one of the things that I would like to kind of bring your attention to. It's not changing the subject, but it's kind of evolving the conversation. In my opinion, the super serial killer that I know exists out there, that today's law enforcement and experts have never acknowledged, and I'm bringing it to the forefront at the very beginning. I am the one saying there is a super serial killer. What he does better than any other serial killer before him is he controls his impulses 100%. Rodney Alcala had the IQ of the super serial killer. He had all the attributes. The one thing he was missing, he could not control, and this is the problem with all serial killers that we've seen thus far, and that is control of his impulses. Rodney Alcala could not control his impulses. And what I mean by that, it doesn't mean that when he's talking to you or me or on a dating game, he's frothing at the mouth, he's, sitting there aroused. No. We're talking about when he sees the victim, that he has chosen to be his victim, he cannot control his impulse. He has to take her. He has to do all these things. And a good example was the first crime we know that he committed was on a very young child of 8 years old, where he picked her up, took her to his apartment, and basically tried to kill her. He did really unspeakable things to the child, and that's why he was on the run in New York.
Yeah. All right. So let's go back to that then. So we'll go to his beginning. I'm always fascinated by the first crimes. Just it gives you a real insight as to the evolutionary process with these guys.
Your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
So Alcala he's described as an academically gifted student who was reasonably popular among his peers and was supported by his family. So you've talked in the past about these guys are much more born than made, and that seems to be the case here. He attended various private schools during his youth, and he was on the yearbook planning committee and on the track and cross country teams. So everything about this guy screamed normal. And yet he goes on the path that he ends up going. That first victim seems to have been, he was about 25 years old. At least that's the first one that we know of. So are you seeing here a consistent? Good. Yeah, good.
No, I was just going to say that I would then say, look, this is the first crime that he was picked up for. And the only reason that he was actually pegged for this is because you had a citizen. And I say this all the time. I always tell, and I've said it a number of times to you, Kevin, and I say it always when I speak at different lectures, be aware of your surroundings. Be safe, be aware of your surroundings. Your life could depend on it. I don't say that someone else's life can depend on it. And this is a perfect case. A person who happened to be watching saw Rodney Alcala pull over. He convinced an 8-year-old child that her parents had sent him to pick her up. And she basically got in the car, and he took her to the apartment. The only reason we know about this and the child survived is because Rodney picked up a tale. Someone saw it and saw it for what it was. It was a situation where an adult was picking up a girl. There was hesitation on the child's part, and the person followed. When he saw Rodney take her into his place, he made a phone call. Police arrived minutes later. This is not an hour later, minutes later, when they knocked on the door. Rodney opens the door. He has no shirt on. He's basically naked. He has a kind of a robe or a towel on. He says he just got out of the shower, and to give the officer the moment, he closes the door and disappears. The officers immediately begin to think something is wrong. They enter the house by force. Rodney Alcala is gone. He has fled through a window, and they find an 8-year-old child, the one he just picked up minutes before that, on the ground with a heavy bar across her neck. She's been beaten, she's been strangled, she's been raped. What this is coming to, and
You have 60 seconds remaining.
the point I'm getting to is that Rodney, this is not his first crime. This is the first one we know about. He's already too refined at age 25 for this to be his first one. There's no hesitation on his part. He takes her home, he rapes her, he tries to kill her. That is the methods of a man who's already done this and understands exactly what and who he is. I'll be back.
Bill, in the time that you spent with him, how close did you get to him? How many conversations did you have? Did you have dinner with him? Describe some of the personal relationship as you were getting to know him and pick his brain and stuff. Go into some of that if you could.
Well, as I said before, he and I met in the county jail when he came back for a full reversal of his case. He'd actually won his appeal, meaning that he was going to be retried for the crimes he was convicted of because he won his appeal. We had already met then and spoken, nothing in depth. It was just pretty much superficial conversations during the time we spent in holding cages to go into the courtroom. And this took, maybe I spent 6-7 months of that. When I arrived on death row in 1988, he arrived shortly after he was convicted again by a jury in Orange County. And we spent a considerable amount of time, because by this time I was already studying human behavior and how those attributes crossed over into serial perpetrators and predators. And I knew at the time that this had never been done before. There was very little in the 80s about serial killers. They were being caught, but no one understood really what and who they were. So I began to research. One of my first test subjects was Rodney Alcala. He and I had a lot of things in common. And what I mean by that is he liked to run every morning before yard.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
He would run for 3-4 hours straight. He had incredible endurance, and that's how our conversations began. Talking about cross-country. He ran cross-country in high school. I ran cross-country in high school. We compared times. That's how conversations started. Of course, I, at that point, was already manipulating a situation where I could get this guy little by little to understand that I was also like-minded, because I wanted him to talk. Of course, I'm not a serial killer, but I wanted him to believe that I was on death row for a crime, but that actually I had and was a serial perpetrator. And that took a number of months, but conversations arose from there. He and I became very close.
So did you find that he opened up to you about things, about his feelings or his problems, fears, any of that stuff?
Yes, the one thing about Rodney Alcala, he was very committed to who he was. He had no problem once he understood and believed that I was like-minded, and that he also believed that I too had the same appetite as him. He began to speak to me. He spoke to me first about photography. You see, I'm also an award-winning artist, so he found that very interesting, that I could draw these pictures that look like photographs, and he was a photographer. So that's how really the relationship began. Cross-country, running, sports, and then the art factor. And once we crossed that bridge of women and bodies. Guy drew bodies, naked bodies and stuff. He began to ask questions. Of course, I knew what he was doing. I was playing maybe arms shelf psychologist at that time, and I was studying him. And he began to divulge to me some of what he liked, what made him attracted to certain situations or people. And that's basically how it started.
Can you go into some of what he said about that?
Sure. We talked about women in general and how he felt about them. And it was really strange because Rodney Alcala, he didn't show any anger as other serial killers did towards women. He considered them objects and things you could possess. He talked, at first he was very reluctant to speak about children. But once I got into his close space or in his proximity of thinking, he immediately allowed me to understand that to him, a child's body is perfect. And he spoke of symmetry, a child's body, how it's proportioned, and how everything is where it's supposed to be. And that he made very, I guess if you want to call it, open and direct statements about a child's body, which it's very difficult to get into, but he spoke of the tautness of a child, how children were innocent, and how that for him was the greatest. And then I asked why he changed, why he liked women. He said that it was more about finding a groove. Children were so difficult because people were often looking after them, and that women were much easier because they thought that they were safe. So I asked him to explain that. He, of course, explained that women did not pay attention to their instincts where children do.
That's a really interesting point because, I've been thinking that obviously it's a lot of serial killers start out with children or with the elderly, not because they're pedophiles, but because those are easier targets. But in one sense, I never really considered in one sense what you're saying, a child can be a tougher target because there are parents, and if a child goes missing, the parents are going to be looking immediately. Whereas a single woman living in the city or something like that, it might be a while before somebody actually notices she's missing. So in some ways, that does make that an easier target. Did he have a preference sexually?
Well, he preferred girls, and what I mean by girls, he preferred teenagers. That was his goal. But it really, for him, and what he said was, it really depended what tickled his fancy, and he used that statement, tickled his fancy. And he said that children were great, and he did not have any problems talking about children. What he did say is that sometimes there was an allure. And again, I'm using words that he used, and I want the audience to be very aware that I'm not talking as if this is something I think. This is something that he told me. He used the word allure of teenage girls, and that it was very easy for him to produce ID and produce an aura of him being a professional photographer. And he said that young girls, as soon as you told them you're a photographer, they almost began to pose immediately as if they were models. They would cock their hip, they would do certain things with their mouth that immediately he knew that he could get them to come with him. And I found that very interesting because that right there, ladies and gentlemen, is an insect already understanding his victims or his prey and how he then can manipulate a situation to draw them close to him. That's exactly what that is. And if you look at insects or predators in the wild, you see this with this type of predator.
Yeah. What is it about the innocence that attracted to him? Did it arouse anger in him, or did it just had an appeal to him? Speak more about the innocence aspect of it.
Well, for him, it was very alluring to him. He liked the innocence, but he also liked that and again, his terms, he liked to dirty them up a little bit. So what he meant by that is that once he dirtied them up, it in his mind, consciously and subconsciously, confirmed what he believed women were. So the younger they were, the faster he can corrupt them in his eyes, because he had sex with them, or I mean, not sex, he raped them. For him, that is a confirmation of his true beliefs. But he didn't show any anger, which is interesting to me. Always was interesting. He never showed anger towards his victims, only that this is what he needed to do.
So do you think maybe the appeal, as it is with many of these guys, was so that it was the power differential? And so when you have someone that's very innocent like that, dirtying them up is just another way of establishing power over them. Would that make sense, Bill?
It does make sense, but with him, I believe that it was more about solidifying in his mind what he already believed to be true, right, which is that he was a bad person. He knew that. That he used to laugh about it. He knew that he was bad, that he was evil. He knew all these things, but that didn't really, it didn't really make his actions any different. He accepted who he was, but now he needed to feel to arouse himself further that he was dirtying them up. It's very similar to when a person sexually talks to another person, and it's adults do it all the time. You know, they play a little role while he liked that role playing while he was with these people, these children, these young women. And for him, it really didn't matter if she was 10, 15, 18, or 28. If he saw that bit of innocence that really piqued his interest, that got him going, that aroused him, he then went after it because he had to do what he did, which is to corrupt them. And that is very important to him, to corrupt them.
So another thing that you've really talked about in the past that I find really, really interesting when it comes to dealing with these serial killers is their process of coming to know what they were. And you're not born into it. At some point you realize you're different than other people. And you're saying that he understood very well who he was. So for instance, when he was growing up, this would have been before the time where the public was talking about serial killers. I don't even think that expression existed yet. So did he have any awareness of that he might be different, and but there were other guys out there like him? Did he ever talk about anything like that?
Yeah, of course. This is something that we went through in depth. And I asked him exactly what you're asking me, and he said at least what he told me, that he knew very early on that he saw things differently. He saw himself as almost an androgynous being. And these are his words. He saw himself as an androgynous being that needed to possess, needed to corrupt, but he knew who he was. And because of his high IQ, he understood it very well. And he had no conscience about what he did. And I don't mean that he wasn't conscious of it. I mean that for example, he had no problem with killing a child. There was no empathy. There was nothing there because he did not look at these people as his equal. They were not, in some ways, human to him.
Right.
He did not feel their pain. He did not feel the parents' pain. All he understood and knew very well, because he did a lot of self-reflection. And what I mean by that is that he didn't think, oh my God, I'm doing this is horrible, I must change. Absolutely the opposite. In his mind, once he understood what got him going, because he was chasing a rush. The first time he took a child, the rush was explosive. He knew what he was looking for. A lot of serial killers, it takes them a while longer. They burn things, they steal things, they torture animals. Rodney didn't have that. For a very early age, he was very popular, but he was always watching himself. He would describe it that he would see himself walking into a room and how people responded to him. He would picture himself running and winning and how people thought of him. He was very conscious of other people's looks and thoughts about him. So he was very self-centered, very egotistical, but he hid it extremely well.
Okay, let's end it here, Bill, and jump to the next one. A movie that came out about 10 or 15 years ago called No Country for Old Men. Have you seen that movie?
I have seen it, yes.
So the main character in that is kind of interesting. It's a fictional character, but he has a worldview where he's obviously kind of a serial killer, even though he has certain jobs he's accepting here, but he enjoys killing. But he sees himself as kind of the hand of fate. He has a worldview and he puts himself in kind of a role there. Did someone like Rodney have a worldview like that and see himself as having any kind of a role or purpose or in any way putting himself in the order of things?
Yeah, he never spoke about that, and I never thought to ask him that question. But from my observations and how I knew him, his view was much more compact. His view was much more centered on himself. He didn't look at himself as a person that would make an impact on the world. He didn't have like a social consciousness of what his deeds did for the rest of the world. His deeds were all about his gratification, about how he interacted in the world and how the world, his immediate social, I guess you want to call it, his social peers saw him. And at any moment, it could be a person in high school looking at him cross the finish line, people on the dating game.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
He actually went on a dating game. And we talked about this. I asked him, well, what the hell, what were you thinking? I mean, you brought attention to yourself. You could have easily been picked out of a lineup because someone remembered you. Because by the time he went on the dating game, if people don't know this, he was already a very well-established serial killer. He had killed multiple women and attacked multiple children. So I told him, well, what were you thinking? I mean, you put yourself out there. Someone could have very easily seen you and said, hey, that's the guy. And he said, man, I was invisible and invincible to them. They just didn't understand what they were dealing with. I went on a dating game to prove to everybody that I could basically walk undetected, that I could actually even get the girl that everybody wanted, and I actually got her. So that was his viewpoint. So it's very compact. He compartmentalized his world.
Do you think he would have killed that woman if she actually, just to tell the audience, the woman chose him, but then eventually got a bad vibe out of it and didn't go on the date that she was supposed to with him? Do you think he would have killed her?
Well, I asked him that question. I think it's a pretty obvious question. I said, oh man, well, had she gone out with you, what would you have done to her? He said, well, I would have went out with her. I wouldn't have killed her right away. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, oh, man, I would have just waited. I would have waited a month or two. I would have come back. And then I would have had my way. I would have been a perfect gentleman before. I would have, the rules, the manipulation would have been complete. Now, once I completed that and she wanted to date me or whatever, I would have come back. I said, I thought he would. He would have never killed us, see? Oh, absolutely. I mean, he looked at her, and look, later on, law enforcement, even to the 2017, 2018, we're still finding bodies. That's the interesting thing about Rodney Alcala. Now the DNA is so advanced, we have cases in Wyoming, Nevada, in multiple states where women ended up finding dead. And we know now that they were attributed to him, that he actually committed those crimes. I asked him one time, what's with all the photographs? You have thousands of them. He said, I photographed children, women, and we talked about how many he killed. His numbers are way, sometimes serial killers exaggerate. And it's like two kids boasting about how many girls they've kissed. Mm-hmm. He boasted numbers above 100. I think that's a little extreme. I believe his numbers are around maybe 55 to 65, because he mentioned a number of cases. And look, So people that are listening, of course, you're thinking, well, hell, if you know so much about these serial killers and about things, why aren't you talking to law enforcement about it? Well, the truth is, I am, and I have. And the Rodney Alcala case is still, in my opinion, an open case. I'm actually working on some factual things about his case to attribute more murders and connect them to him. A number of family members of other families have come to me and asked me to look at these cases, and I'm doing exactly that. So please believe that Kevin and I are not just doing this for kicks. But there's actually a purpose behind it. We give this information so maybe it'll jog someone's memory as well, and someone says, hey, look, this is what happened, and we can basically get more clues to who he was. He told me a lot of things. He told me a lot about the women that he killed and the children, and the ones that disappeared that were never seen again. When he was arrested, more than 1,000 photographs were found, as well as trinkets, as well as trophies of a number of women that have never been located before. Mm-hmm. So his case, in my opinion, should be always open because of the numbers of murders that can and eventually will be attributed to him.
His period of killing was almost 20 years, right? It was basically through most of the 60s and the 70s. And though he did do 2 stints in jail during that time, did he kill boys? Is there any evidence of that? And where were the locations that he killed? We know New York City and obviously California. What's the range that he operated in or hypothetically operated in?
Well, there was no range. There was Washington. There was obviously Wyoming. There has been a case, a recent discovery, a few years, that a woman was found in Wyoming, and she is one of his victims. There's photographs of her in his collection. He killed her. California was a big hunting ground for him. He said he loved the fun and the sun, but he traveled. He went to New York in the late 60s, early 70s, and he has a few murders there as well, in apartment buildings. He actually killed a very famous woman she was the goddaughter of Sammy Davis Jr. So there's, he got around. His range, there is no range. Wherever he was at, wherever he felt that he had that calling or that urge, he did what he had to do.
Did he kill boys?
Not that what he was. I asked him about that. And I said, look, there's photographs that you took of boys. He said, well, I was just taking pictures. I was doing my job as a photographer. He actually worked for the Los Angeles Times as well. He worked for them, and it was something that a lot of true crime people that are interested in it don't know about, is that actually Rodney Alcala at one time worked in New York at an insurance company office, and in the same office another serial killer was working there, and that's the torso killer.
Yeah,
they worked in the same office. What are the chances you have 2 mega serial killers working in the same office together?
Now, I know he didn't know that guy at all at the time, but did he talk about it at all with you?
He did not, because I had no idea about that at the time. So could he have known? Look, it's, I always say that being a student of human behavior gives me a few things that I always look. I had an ex-wife that used to always tell me that when I would look at anybody, I'd look at all their features, everything about them, and I'd notice the room and everybody in it in one split second. Usually I can tell another athlete. I usually can tell another tough guy, a predator, another gang member, whatever. I could always tell by just looking at them.
Yeah.
Being as observing as I am, and understanding that a serial killer is in fact a predator recognizes another predator. Maybe not fully, but I imagine that there was some type of knowledge that he was in a close proximity to another predator. I just can't not believe that someone with an IQ as high as Rodney's would not have recognized that.
Yeah, I agree with that. If he had it, this may have been, some of those big insurance and financial companies might have thousands of employees there, so he may have never come into contact with them. But I agree that if he did come into any kind of contact, you're right. He probably would have recognized something. Something on his antenna would have been up.
And remember, this is late 60s, early 70s, these offices didn't have 1,000 people. They had a few dozen people. And that's why I think that, in fact, he knew exactly what he was looking at. They may not have talked. They may not have had a relationship or shared, because for the most part, serial killers are lone predators. There are some exceptions that have crime partners and share. With me, I had to really sell myself as being someone who never got caught as a serial perpetrator, and therefore I had things to share. We had things in common. It's a tough cookie to sell, but I spent decades there with him and a number of other serial killers who I spoke about, which we, obviously, you and I will cover in the next few weeks and months that come. But there are ways to get close to serial killers, but you need what law enforcement doesn't have, which is time and the knowledge of what they really are. You know, these most law enforcement interview people in a room, and the perpetrator, the serial killer, knows exactly who's in charge there. So he's playing a part worthy of an Oscar, or some reporter comes to see him in a visiting room.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
And of course, the perpetrator is acting. With me, there was no act, because they believed that I was one of them. So there's a lot more things that are shared over decades, where they see me every day. It's not a couple hours, it's not a week or 2 weeks. It's 25, 30, 35 years together. That gives me a special insight into these guys, and more so, it's not like you're the daughter of a serial killer, and you just knew daddy. Later on, you find out it's a serial killer, and you start playing armchair quarterback. I knew exactly what these guys were, so my intent from the very beginning was to fool them.
What are some of their interests, or do they have interests outside of their obsessions? And particularly Rodney.
Yeah, they have normal interests. Rodney loved the law, he loved to study the law, and he loved to run. He was a huge fan of running. You have other serial killers who are, for example, BTK. He had interest outside of being a killer. Serial killers, for the most part, do and act normal. There are exceptions, of course, ones that have very low IQs, and they have even more trouble than most controlling their impulses, so they just live in that moment, reliving the moment over and over and over. The ones that are good at what they do, they're out there for decades and no one catches them, because they have, very normal interests.
So like when he's with you in jail, does he have an interest in politics, religion, sports, obviously besides his own personal interest in running, but there are other subjects, art. So obviously you're an artist and he was a photographer. Are there things like that he was interested to talk to other people about?
Yeah, well, not a lot of other people. He did not open up to many people. I was able to get very close to him, and, he loved film. I believe that it's common knowledge that he studied under Pulaski, a number of these. Well, and that's kind of an interesting thing, too, because that guy is considered also a rapist. So he studied under some of the better film directors and photographers of the 20th century. So he had a lot of different interests. As I said, he was very intelligent.
Yeah. I didn't know that he studied under Pulaski. That's pretty wild. Does he have a sense of humor? Is there anything like that where he appreciates a joke or a prank or something like that, or likes to needle you, or any of the?
You have 60 seconds remaining.
Any of the more human side?
Yeah, the answer is absolutely. These guys come across as normal people. If they didn't, they would have been suspected a lot earlier of just being creepy guys. Now, some of these guys are creepy guys.
Yeah.
Rodney was extremely refined. As I said, he spoke very well. He interacted extremely well. He adapted extremely well to any situation. The guy was a sociopath. Well, most politicians are, and he was in some ways a politician.
Now, Bill, I understand that these guys generally don't have regrets in the sense of feeling any empathy for their victims. But does he have regrets, for instance, of maybe if he had better control of his impulses, he wouldn't be in jail? Or does he have regrets where he says, maybe I would still want to be who I am and commit these crimes, but do a better job so I wouldn't get caught? Are there any kind of regrets that he expresses along those lines?
Not that he expressed to me, only that, he actually joked about this, and a lot of serial killers on death row joke about this. We're in California, and I was at San Quentin prison, so the rules are a little bit ruled by Democrats. So what I mean by that is that because he was on death row and he had a death penalty hanging over his head, a lot of taxpayers don't understand that when you give a serial perpetrator, and by the way, they should get the death penalty, but when you give them the death penalty, it changes the entire ballpark for them. What I mean by that is the funding given to the attorneys, investigators, and his participation in an appeal, especially when he was representing himself, was huge. It was huge because he then had the opportunity to be his own attorney and therefore got all of the evidence that an attorney would normally get, meaning his crime scene, the victim's crime scene, the victim's phone number, the victim's information, photographs of the victim in the coroner's office, victims when they were found at the crime scene. All these things spell one thing for a serial killer: thank you very much. You've just given me what I worked so hard to collect, which is his body of work. Rodney used to giggle in fits that he had every photograph of every person attributed to him killing. Even more so, because he was his own attorney, or in pro se, or propria persona, he got investigators to go get other cases that he was involved in so he can get his rocks off again, and he would look at those photographs. Of course, you're thinking, well, why did those investigators turn them in? Ladies and gentlemen, there's a thing called privileged information or privileged confidentiality that attorneys have to abide by. They're part of the canons of law. So everything that they learned, they could never turn over to the prosecution. So Rodney Alcala got every photograph that he ever wanted the whole time he spent on death row of all these victims. And most serial killers,
Yeah, go ahead, finish up.
And they get exactly what they want, all the gratification they want. He described it as an artist's body of work. His body of work lived with him every single day.
So basically, these guys lie in their cell, reliving their crimes and using the material they're entitled to from their own defense as fuel.
Exactly. And that's something that look, there's nothing you can do.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
When a prosecution or a state decides to seek the death penalty, get a death penalty, of course, that person then has a right to defend himself. These are part of the Constitution. There's nothing you can do about it. I'm sure people are thinking, well, there's got to be something you can do. Well, yeah, take the death penalty off the table. You're not executing these guys for the most part. California has had a death penalty as long as I can remember. Since 1967, we've only had 13 executions. Most of the guys have died of old age, or they got stabbed and killed in the yard there. I've talked about the costs of the death penalty. It's fiscally irresponsible is what it is. And I'm an advocate. Look, I believe the easiest way for these serial killers, you take them out behind the courthouse and just kill them. Simple. But people don't agree with me, and people are appalled that I would say something like this. But the truth of the matter is, it is the truth. I lived on death row for nearly 40 years. I know the system probably better than anybody does. I studied law. I understand the rights these guys have. And when it comes to serial perpetrators, rapists, child molesters, I'm a little bit lax on their rights, okay? Let's just put it that way.
Because there's no way to reform them. They're not going to change what they are.
Exactly. A guy that kills someone, he's 18 years old, he has a bad day, it's a robbery, he shoots the person, he kills a person for reasons that you can put logic behind. Greed, whatever. They can be rehabilitated if they choose to be rehabilitated. In many cases, guys don't want to be rehabilitated. Some do. But with serial perpetrators like rapists, child molesters, etc., there is no rehabilitation. There is none.
Right. And clearly, even just from the ones that you've lived with, they don't even want that. They're comfortable in their own skin with who they are and what they've been their whole lives, and they don't have any desire to change it.
They do not, because they accept who they are, and they like who they are. They wouldn't change who they are if you tried to change them, or you could change them. They love what they do.
How much did Rodney pay attention? Well, did he pay attention to the headlines before he was caught, and how much did he pay attention to it afterwards?
Yeah, it's really interesting you asked that, because we had a conversation about murders that he was accused of and those he wasn't accused of. He actually made fun of a guy that was on death row who was also a serial killer and said he got accused and convicted of that crime and he didn't do it. I said, how do you do it? He goes, because I did it. And he laughed. He said law enforcement, they find an MO or something likeness, and they're willing to throw it at anybody. He said, there are crimes that I committed that were attributed to other people, because while he was killing and while he was doing his thing, that's what he called it, his thing, there was more than 7 serial killers in Orange County and L.A. that were doing something very similar. And Rodney Alcala killed in L.A. County, Orange County, and went back and forth.
I want to talk about the role of fantasy. We can talk generally, but specifically to Rodney Alcala, because it's my belief that you and I have talked in the past. We both agree that serial killers are generally born, not made, in the sense that their brains are wired different. But obviously, statistically, 2% of the global population is born with a psychopathic brain. That's what the evidence is for a long time. And obviously, most of them don't become serial killers. So the other component, you have to develop an obsession with killing. For some reason, you have to get off on that. And a lot of people have talked about it. For instance, even Ted Bundy and various others, that they developed this as they were in their early adolescent age, and their fantasies were developing. So, is there any evidence? Did Rodney talk about that, or are you aware of any evidence of that being a development in him? You have a desire to start killing people and torturing people, and
yes. Well, he didn't have any idea at a very early age that he needed to kill people to get to that level of rush or that level of pleasure. It developed. It developed with time. The more things that he did, he realized that the closer he got to death, as death being an element, it took his level of sexual arousal to a whole new peak. And I asked him about the small child, and I'm not mentioning her name for a reason. I believe in when children are involved in a situation, we don't mention their names. There's no reason for that child to have any more trauma in her life. That's why I'm not mentioning it. I say the child. She survived, and I don't want to bring any more trauma to that child in any way, shape, or form. But he did. I asked her about that, and I asked, he said, man, they just got to me quick. He goes, that son of a bitch saw something, he called the cops, and they came. And I asked him about it, and this was very difficult for me because I wanted to strangle the guy. Believe me when I tell you that this research that I did, the thesis that I've written on this particular subject, was extremely excruciating for me to ask these questions and play the part with them, because all I wanted to do was choke this guy out. But he was telling me that as he was having sex, and this is a horrible situation, that as he was killing her because he had beat her, he had a bar across her neck, he was strangling her, that was what got him going. He understood that killing, taking the threshold to the moment of death where he is the deliverer of death.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
Where he is the deliverer of death, takes his sexuality, his sexual pleasure to a stratosphere 1,000 times more intense than a normal climax.
Did he ever, for instance, a lot of these guys had their early fantasies fueled by, say, detective books that had suggestive images of women in bondage or in peril and stuff like that. Did he develop as a youth? Did he look at porn? Did he look at magazines or anything? Did anything fuel his fantasies like that?
Yeah, I always get a kick out of that because a lot of psychologists say that, and I've read most of the books that psychologists have read, and I get a kick out of that. Because one serial killer in history mentioned that he liked detective magazines and the women in bondage really sparked his interest. And every psychologist since then quotes this kind of crap. And this is the reason I always say that their serial killers continue to do what they do because people keep believing all this regurgitated crap that these so-called experts continue to bring to the forefront. It is old news. It's something that was written about, and other people have read it, and they continue to use that particular line of thinking, and it's absolutely correct. I asked Rodney Alcala specifically, and we talked about it like we were two good old buddies about what got him going. He never mentioned porn. He never mentioned none of those things. What he did mention is that as soon as he saw a girl that made him feel a certain way, and look, all of us, you know it, there was a girl in high school that, there were a lot of pretty girls, but one of them really caught your attention, right? One of them just really was it. You're like, wow. And she probably wasn't that wow factor to everybody else, but she was to you. It's the same thing with serial killers. There are serial killers that like porn. Rodney's one of them. He used to look at porn on death row. How do I know this? Because I know who the porn king was on death row. And it was Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, and Lawrence Bittaker, the toolbox killer. And Rodney bought directly from Lawrence Bittaker. Again, how do I know this? I was standing right there when he bought it, and Lawrence Bittaker brought him the pornography magazines. So I do understand that. I know it, I see it, but I asked Rodney about that. He likes looking at it because, like any other man, he likes looking at pornography. But what got it for him, as soon as he saw somebody that really got him going, he knew it on the spot. And it wasn't because of a past fantasy or anything else. It was someone at that particular moment that just tickled his fancy.
When these guys are getting access to porn magazines, is it just, what kind of, like, for instance, do they have access to magazines that would be S&M or bondage or anything like that?
Yes.
They do.
Yeah, the answer is yes. And that is no longer the case in the California Department of Corrections. They've changed those rules where you can have any kind of depiction of women in sexual acts or frontal nudity. These are new rules. But back in the 80s and 90s, anything went. You could go to any porn place or whatever and buy anything you wanted. S&M, bondage. There was even books that were called Barely Legal, where there were 18-year-old girls that looked like they were 12 or 13, and they were depicted in these magazines. And these guys got it. This is something the public doesn't know, but this is something that was very prevalent back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in prisons.
That's disturbing.
But it's not.
2 seconds remaining.
So you're saying
it is,
not,
believe me. And when... Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to say it's very disturbing, especially when you are looking at these guys and become aroused at these things and comment on the women and what they say. It's extremely disturbing. But this is the truth of the matter, and this is what really happens in prisons, at least back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and before that. Let me call you back, Kevin.
So, I'm always interested in the origins, and I know you and I have talked about how these guys are born. Is there any point where there was something in the environment that it even contributed in some small way to this guy becoming the killer, or was he just destined to be what he was from day one, from the day out of the womb?
There are all these twists. Every killer is different. And when I mean killer, I mean serial killer. So yes, in that way, you can't look at a particular killer and because he kills women who are shaped a certain way, or he kills women who are wearing red shoes. The signature, which I've talked about and is very unique to every serial killer, and what I mean by signature, and I've talked about this before, but I'll re-elaborate. It's the easiest way to describe it to you is if you look at a basketball player when he goes to the free throw line, he does a number of things before he shoots the ball. He dribbles twice, he touches his face, he looks at the audience, he touches his hair, and then he shoots the basketball. That is a ritual. That's a signature. Baseball players do the same thing. They come to the bat, they touch their gloves, they grab their shoelace, they tip their hat, they swing the bat twice, and then they're ready to hit the ball. Every time the ball is wind up and thrown in, they do the same ritual. That's a signature. Now, when it comes to these particular killers, every one of them has something that may have changed them. They were going to be killers to begin with because they're always, when they begin burning things, torturing animals, in some cases they start off very quickly by attempting to kill someone or sexually assaulting women or becoming peeping toms. Already there's a sexuality to what they're doing. The very unique thing about these serial killers is they're able to sexualize control or sexualize the stalking of a victim. The interaction with the person. They can sexualize that. That's a very unique thing that is born in someone. They cannot learn that. It's not a learned behavior. So yes, there are a few things that can change a child. He was already going to be a killer, but the component of sex, the way the sex is administered, the way the sex is obtained can be tweaked. The signature can be tweaked. But that's it. The rest of it is him. He's like a tiger. A tiger's already going to kill and eat. We know it's a meat eater. You can feed it all the vegetables you want, but you stick a deer in there, he's going to kill and eat it. Yeah. Now, if you train that tiger, he might kill a little bit of a different way. He might do something slightly different, which is the signature. But for the most part, they're going to do what they're going to do.
Did Rodney ever torture animals as a child?
He said he did not. He said he found that to be beneath him. He said that killing animals that were defenseless, and of low IQ really had no bearing on any kind of excitement for, which I found interesting because he said defenseless. And if I were being mean and I could take off the mask that I was wearing, I would have grabbed him by the throat and said, "Really? So that 8-year-old girl wasn't defenseless?"
Did he ever, when he was in high school, he seemed like he was built to be a popular guy. It said he was relatively popular. He was a good student. He was on the track team, on the yearbook committee, and all that stuff. Did he ever date any girls in high school?
Yeah, according to him, he had a very normal childhood. He did fluctuate between Mexico and his parents are Mexican, but he was popular. He had friendships. He had alliances. He was part of committees. He was part of the yearbook. He ran in cross country. He was a varsity player. All these things are very normal. So I find it very interesting.
Did he have sexual encounters in high school? Did he have any normal sexual encounters in high school?
Yeah, according to him, girls were ready to spread their legs for him, and these are his words. They were always ready to, but that's not what got him going. He found that to be not a challenge for him, that women were already there. It was not that big of a deal. The reason that Rodney Alcala killed is because he said that it took the experience of sex to a level 1,000 times more intense, and the rush of taking a life while you're having sex to be the most erotic and pleasurable experience that anybody could even describe to him.
Right. And that's purely chemical. I mean, our brains are largely chemical, and we're hardwired to get a rush from certain levels of it's normal to get a rush from certain levels of dominating another human being. You get a rush
and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
You get a rush if you beat someone in a game of checkers. You get a rush if you get a big rush if you're a male and you beat someone in a sporting event or in a fight. So those are normal things that within the brain. But then obviously there are some people that are born when the wiring that is off, and they have an abnormal response over it. And because they have no empathy, they have nothing to limit the fantasy from developing around to the ultimate destination of killing, wanting to kill people.
Yeah, well, he spoke of dominance. He loved to dominate. That's why some of his victims, he'd tie them, he'd pose them. He did different things. He was a mixed bag of tricks. He had a number of different things that got him going. Sometimes he'd pose the women. He left the ropes tied to them. He left them in certain positions. It's just whatever tickled his fancy, but dominance was very big for him because as he kills, he's in complete control and he's dominating at a level only that can be. The threshold of death was his catch. That was it for him.
Did you get any insights from your conversations and your studying of Rodney that would be useful in helping solve other older unsolved cases, or even just catching a modern serial killer?
Well, all of it was, in my own words, academic. It was an experience. It was academic. I understood what we're coming from. I understand serial killers on a whole different level. I believe, yes, what I know, how they act, what makes them tick, what are their hunting grounds, how they hunt, how they visualize things, can help law enforcement catch these guys substantially earlier than in most cases. Nowadays, you catch serial killers because of DNA profiles, of touch DNA, etc. I actually believe that these serial killers can be hunted. And what I mean by hunted, I don't mean just normal police work. This would take a special...
This call and/or telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
A specialized team headed by, well, a mind stalker. A person who is unique in himself, unique to other people. Just like a serial killer is very unique. If there's black, there's white. If there's heaven, there's hell. If there are serial killers, there is a person who has been developed. Look, humans are very evolutionary type of beast, animals. If there is deer, there's got to be a wolf to contain it. Same thing with serial killers. If there's a predator out there, there's an apex predator that can catch him because he thinks a lot like him. It doesn't make him a bad guy, doesn't make him a good guy. He's just a hunter. I believe that what I know and the way that I can move, interact, get close to them, I could find serial killers substantially faster than law enforcement. Now, the rules would have to change because they have a lot of rules that do not allow law enforcement to kick down doors and just... And look, I understand the civil rights behind this stuff. That's why this team had to be specialized. I think John Douglas, one of the premier pioneers of serial killers and the study of them, said it very eloquently that the serial killer is a very unique animal. To catch him, you have to think like him. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in this case, to catch them, to save kids, save people, it takes a killer to catch a killer.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you very much, Bill. This has been a great interview. As always, we get a lot of insights. You and I have a lot of interesting discussions privately that I've recorded that develop a lot of insights too. So hopefully we'll keep bringing these to the audience. And as we get the new channel up and going, people will be able to get questions to us, to Bill, directly through the channel and give and share some of their own insights and questions about it. So thank you again, Bill.
Well, I thank you for having me, and please, I always like to say that I speak at any kind of function or any kind of channel. Look, be safe, be aware of your surroundings. Your life could depend on it.